we looked at subjective filters. We talked about a lot of stuff, but one of the key lessons is that we perceive reality through filters, and reality by itself has no inherent meaning. So we have to assign meaning to it, and the way we do so is largely unconscious as we perceive it. So we've looked at, there's a number of different filters or different ways in which we do so. Part of it is through instinct, nature, so our senses have evolved to perceive only certain things. By the way, when we were looking at how we tend to, what directs our attention last class, and I was showing you, for example, an example of an attractive person, right? And that automatically draws our eyes, or a loud noise. Advertisement, think about how advertisers use that to direct our attention, right? Advertisement, billboards, they often use techniques, based on what we're naturally drawn to in nature. But we also saw that we have cultural filters, language being a center piece of that, which shapes what kind of functional gestalts we have available to us, how we form them, how we name them. And we looked at how your personal history also helps you develop your own very personal filters, sometimes different from the ones your culture gave you. And we saw that there's different stages of development that your worldview goes through. So your worldview, your filters are extremely complex. Our filters are extremely complex. They are fundamental to us. They really are what allow us to survive and function. They're what gives meaning to our society. However, there are a number of problems with our subjective filters, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. What are the issues that tend to arise from our subjectivity? And then we'll devote the next 2 lectures after this lecture to solutions to those problems. What can we do about the problems that we will talk about today? So, one of the key problems that many of the other problems derive from is what I might call ideological rigidity. Rigidity of your worldview. So, when we are very young, children, babies and then children, we are very flexible. We are very plastic. Our brain is plastic. Our ideology is very plastic. We can learn a bunch of different things. You could have been born in a completely different family or culture, and you would have turned out, your worldview would have turned out completely different. So we tend to absorb what our environment gives us. We tend to model what people around us do. If we have siblings, older siblings, we tend to model what they do. If we have parents or our caretakers that are around, we tend to model what they do. Even if we have domestic animals, we tend to model what they do, right? My son likes to imitate our dog, and borrow stuff from him. So we tend to be very plastic, and as we grow and we start to formalize our worldview, the more we acquire, the less plastic we become. So the more we have a stable, as we build our worldview, we try to stabilize it, and the more, it's like a house that you start with the foundation, and at first there's a lot of possibilities of how you're going to build your house, what it's going to look like. But once you've made a few fundamental decisions, at the time they might be conscious, but later you forget about them. They just, become beneath the surface. Then you have less choices, less possibilities, less different ways to go. So it's a natural phenomenon that our worldview becomes more rigid as we age. Like, you might have noticed that older people tend to be more set in their ways, right? Maybe your grandparents or older people tend to have a harder time to change, to accept new technologies, new ways of doing things. And that's a function of what I'm talking about. So young children, very flexible. Older children, a little bit less. Adolescents, a little bit less. Young adults, a little bit less, still flexible. And as you age, less flexible. So there's advantages to being less flexible, which is you have stability. Hopefully, if you've built a solid worldview, a pretty expansive worldview, then it serves you well. It allows you to make a sense of a whole lot of complexity in the world and be successful in the environments that you exist in. And you don't have to change it much. Now imagine, though, when your environment changes radically. Imagine that you were in a plane going somewhere, and the plane crashes in the northern regions, and you're trapped there for, you have to survive there for a few months. Everything you know about survival, about what allows you to survive and thrive, goes a little bit out the window, and you have to adapt to a completely different way of being. If you go to another country, another culture, Cedric was talking yesterday about how difficult it is to just even like be in a culture with different language, different habits. You have to relearn how to function. Not complete, it's not quite as radical, but so whenever we have a new environment, we have to readapt our worldview. There are natural points in our life where that happens. We were talking about teenage years, when you move from being a child to beginning of an adult, when you move different grade levels, when you go to university, when you start a new job, when you enter a committed romantic relationship, maybe, if you become a parent, if you deal with a particular illness. There's a few events that can rock our boat, rock our worldview, and we have to adapt. Right? So, but one of the problems with the notion that we have subjective filters and that they are unconscious is because they are unconscious, many times it's hard to question them. It's hard to put them in question. Furthermore, the earlier filters, the ones that we acquired very young, are the hardest to change. So if our parents emphasize certain values and certain ways of seeing the world very early on, those are things that we really don't even remember, but we tend to adopt those, and it's really hard for us to question that. Some classical example might include your religious beliefs. If your parents have strong religious beliefs and they enforce them very early on, it's very hard for you to question that. You might still be able to do so, but it's hard to do that if it was, the earlier it was imparted, the harder it is to question. The same is true for political beliefs, but there's other, certain beliefs about how you should handle yourself, politeness, certain rules that you need to follow in the household of your parents, how you're supposed to eat, how you're supposed to be clean. So those are things that can be hardwired and hard to change. Some of us are pretty flexible, pretty open-minded. In fact, there's a scale that can tell you, a psychological scale that can tell you how open-minded and how flexible you are. And some of us are more set in our ways at the same age, right? Less flexible. And what I'm suggesting here is that the less flexible you are, if you're too rigid, if you're really set in your ways and you can't change, you can't evolve, that's a problem. That's a major problem. You're going to run in trouble when you interact with others. By this I mean, what do I mean by ideological rigidity? I'm not referring specifically to any domain like religion or political beliefs, although that's there. I'm talking about your entire set of beliefs, assumptions about nature. Like, there are some things, for example, that some people have traumatic childhoods. They are neglected by their parents. Their parents are not available for multiple reasons. Maybe their parents are too young, or they have other things to do, or they're overwhelmed. And maybe like you have people grow up in a household with only one parent who's working, and they might be neglected, right? Or they might have parents who can't handle a young child, and so they get upset and don't respond, don't give them what they need, or get upset and angry and start yelling at the child every time they cry, right? And that leads to very fundamental, when we're talking about your worldview, that very early on leads you to form certain beliefs. For the example of which, if your caretaker is not able to respond to you in a loving, kind way, in a helping way when you cry, when you're an infant, this can lead to the belief that you have to take care of yourself on your own, that nobody's going to help you. That can lead you to be deeply distrusting of others. Not trust that others will be there for you and have your back. Right? And that can lead you to have a kind of like darker view of the world, of people, a more negative view of people, and also be more self-reliant, be less likely to ask for help. Now, if you have a caretaker who's always there for you, who responds most of the time, who's loving, who provides you with what you need, this will help you develop a different kind of belief that you can rely on people, that people will help you, and you're more likely to ask for help and to trust people. Right? Those kind of early beliefs are really, really hard to change. You can change them, but they're really hard to change. What's really interesting when you look at the psychology of how we develop our worldviews is we acquire language we start acquiring language after about 1 year of age. And so that means that our brain develops already when we are in the womb. Before we're born, we already start to develop certain categories, right? Certain feelings. In particular, we respond to how our mother feels. So how your mother feels, the environment that your mother is in while she's pregnant, has a huge impact already on your psychology. Through everything you share the blood supply that your mother has. So all of the hormones that are associated with certain emotions pass on into the child. So if the mother is relaxed and happy, that has a certain kind of impact. It's different than if the mother is stressed or is in an environment that's not relaxed, right? And after you're born, you start to, at first, infants cannot even focus their eyes. We have no sense of depth of field. So we start to adjust our eyes and develop the ability to recognize things. But there's a lot of stuff that we learned before we acquire language. And a lot of it is deep, fundamental emotional orientations to the world. And because they are pre-verbal orientations, even if you have very early beliefs that are pre-verbal that exist in us, it's very hard to change that because if you do a psychoanalysis, for example, you can't even talk about stuff because you didn't have language available to you at the time. So that's how deep your worldview goes. The earliest aspects of your foundation of your worldview are pre-verbal, and that makes them even more unconscious. Now, even after you acquire language, a lot of the stuff that occurs early in your childhood and later, you tend to forget about it. But it still orients your filters. So that's why it's unconscious. So the rigidity is not just an unwillingness to change, but it's related to the difficulty to actually see what our worldview is like, to see our filters, to gain consciousness of them, to understand when they appeared. Now, we're going to look at specific delineations of this blanket problem with our subjective filters.